My name is Victor Fraga. I'm from Dirty Movies, and I am absolutely thrilled to be at the Brazilian Embassy in London talking to one of the most prominent and important Brazilian directors at present. His name is Karim Aïnouz. He's visiting London. He has very recently completed a film, Futuro Beach, which is a very interesting tale about immigration, about homosexuality. He has also authored Madame Satã, which is a film about a real-life character, cross-dresser from Brazil in the 1930s. So it is absolutely no exaggeration to say that Karim is a very, very important voice, not just in the film industry, but for the LGBT culture in Brazil. So Karim has completed, and he will correct me if I'm wrong, nearly 20 films altogether, including television, cinema, and short films. And he currently lives in Berlin. And my first question is going to be about his film, Futuro Beach. The film is set half in Brazil, half in Berlin. It's the story of Donato, a lifeguard who is infatuated with a German person, and he moves to Germany to live with the man. When he moves to Germany, to Berlin, to live with Conrad, he breaks up with his Brazilian identity, and he no longer gets in touch with his family. So, as an immigrant yourself, Karim, can you tell me a little bit what it means to be Brazilian, living in Europe, and why you decided to make a movie about immigration and rupture?
Yeah, I think, in the first place, something which is very close to me. I'm half Brazilian, actually, half Algerian. My father's Algerian, and it was something that I was growing up with all the time. And I remember when I first moved from Brazil, I was 18. I was living in France. My family, my father's side of the family is there. And it was a really complicated moment of my life, coming out to Europe, being a bit Arabic, being a bit Brazilian, and living in a country where, the immigration politics was so complicated. So I think the question of migration was something that was very close to me throughout my whole life, and also my family, my Algerian family migrated to France. So the question of displacement and migration was something that was very touching to me. But I think the beginning of Praia do Futuro, it's funny that we're in London. I remember that I had a friend from Brazil. He's from Brasilia, I think. This is in the early 90s. And he moved to London. He had I think it was an English boyfriend, and he lived here for a long time. And I think there was a moment that he passed away. It was the time of, the AIDS crisis and so on. So he died. And the family never actually... He was buried here, and he actually kind of disappeared. The family never heard from him again because he was quite ashamed, to be sick, and he was quite ashamed to be here. So that story really stuck to me, and the question of migration really stuck to me. And I really wanted to actually then make a movie where a character crosses the Atlantic, goes to have a life somewhere else, and to be able to have a new life has somehow to erase his past, And when I was making Praia do Futuro, it was really interesting because actually on the script, the character moves to Germany and he gets in touch with his family and he slowly disappears. But when I was making the film, I actually wanted to do a film about rupture and about like erasing your past and beginning anew somewhere else and almost acquiring a new identity. So I thought that was a way of talking about migration, which was perhaps interesting, that I didn't see many films dealing with. I mean, I think every time we talk about migration, it's talked about in a very frontal way, but not in a subjective way. Mm-hmm. And I think there's always this fantasy of, when you migrate somewhere, to begin something completely different and to start something completely new. Mm-hmm. So there's a big, I think it's very courageous to do that, when you do that kind of step in your life. But at the same time, you leave a lot behind. And I always have the feeling like the past comes to haunt you at some point. And this is what the film is about in a way. It's about this very brave act of like moving somewhere and re-beginning your life. On the case of Donato, the main character of the film, there was also the question of sexuality.
Yeah.
It's not like he was expelled from Brazil because he was gay, but I think there was a sense of discomfort that he has, which in the film is never really clear why, but there's a sensation. I really wanted to do a film about a character which is really not comfortable in his own skin, not comfortable where he comes from, and somehow conquers a different place in the place that he goes to. But, you can't really break from your past completely. It always comes back to you. And so the story of the film is, half of the film is about the fact of crossing the Atlantic, of beginning a new life, of, initiating a new movement in your life and breaking from the past. And the second half of the film is actually, he leaves behind his family, he leaves behind, a younger brother that comes to find him when he is older, So he leaves a younger brother when he leaves to Germany. The younger brother is about 8. And the kid grows up, becomes an 18-year-old, and comes to look for him in Berlin and to try and, so it's, in one hand, for me, there was something in the film which I was very interested in, which is there was a certain generation, and that's not clear in the film, but it's the beginning of the 2000s. There was a moment which was, being gay in Brazil is always very complicated, at the same time that it's very accepted, it's like super violent, and there's so many people that die every day because of it. I think it's 246 a year, if you want to talk about statistics, is something really huge. So what for me was important is that for him, he needed to break from his past, he needed to begin a new life. And when the brother comes, what I really wanted to talk about was sexual identity, sexual politics, and generational crisis. So when he left, he needed to lie for his brother. He needed to be, completely undercover when he comes to Germany. And when the brother comes to find him, there's a moment in the film that he says, it's no big deal. You could have told me that you do have come, But so it's really also about how sexuality and sexual politics, it's viewed and experienced from one generation, and how it's experienced from another generation. What was a crisis for the older brother, for the younger brother when he grows up, it's not such a crisis anymore. So I was always wanting to talk about what it meant, what sexual politics were 10 years or 15 years ago and what they are now. So the film also deals with not only the question of migration, but also the question of identity and how identity is negotiated today.
And perhaps how Brazil is a little bit more comfortable with homosexuality.
Yeah.
It's not, obviously it's not paradise, but I believe it's moved on.
It's different. I think it's different. It's very funny. I remember I was very much involved in the foundation of a festival called Mix Brazil, which is the first lesbian and gay experimental. It was actually not experimental. I was doing this festival in New York, and then we started to do it in Brazil. And I remember as if it were today, that we're bringing the cassettes. At the time it was like, this is old school stuff. And so we're bringing the cassettes of the festival to São Paulo. It was 1993, and it was really incredible, how we managed to do that festival. It's a festival that exists until today. All this to say that I think there was no gay pride parade. I don't know if you remember that. I think the gay pride parade is something that starts in the 2000 or something.
98, I can say.
98,
because I was living in São Paulo that year.
So I think it's really interesting when, in a way, you think, it's one of the biggest gay prides in the world. And at the same time, we still have such a violent culture.
The highest number of gay murders in the world. Yeah,
I think we're a gold medal.
Yeah.
I think it was Mexico and us, and I think we're ahead of it, at this time this time in history. So, but it's also interesting because when we made Praia, and Praia was released, it was 2014, and the film was made between 2012 and 2014.
Yeah,
and it's so sad, it's worse now.
Mm-hmm.
Hate crimes and, the way that sexuality and sexual identity is being sort of negotiated in Brazil today, it's sadly and ironically much worse than it was 2 years ago, So it's funny, I keep, sometimes you go to bed and have your head in your pillow and you think, that's the moment that you really think about certain things. And I just keep thinking, what about if Praia had been released now, At the time, it was already complicated, the release of the film, but now, and so it's quite sad that we actually, when I think of 93, starting Mix, bringing that festival to Brazil, there was a sense that we're moving somewhere in the sense of freedom and in the sense of
we're moving
tolerance.
back.
And there's a sense of intolerance.
Backlash now,
which is very sad.
Okay. Well, very importantly, we have looked at Praia do Futuro. It's a brilliant film. Do check our website for our review and find out how to watch the film. The film stars Wagner Moura, brilliant actor, which you may know from the American TV series Narcos. Also, I wanted to ask you, do you think it would have been very different if Praia do Futuro, if Donato had met an Englishman and had come to London instead of Berlin? Do you think the experience would have been the same, or do you think it would have been different?
I think in one hand, it would have been the same because it's about entering a completely different culture. But what for me was interesting to do the film in Berlin, and I think the film could only have been done in Berlin, is I thought I think Berlin is this kind of city. I call it like a Lazarus city. It's a city that it's rebirth, at every 10 or 15 years. It was the First World War, and then it was the Second World War, and it was the crisis, and then there was, the war, and then there was, communism, and then, so it's a city that I think it's reinventing itself at every decade or every 2 decades. And for me, it was very important that the character migrates to a city which is going through the same transformational process that he's going as well, that it's beginning again. So I think technically it could have been London, but I think the only city that I thought somehow mirrored the character was a city like Berlin or maybe Beirut. It was a city like that, that's been bombed and begins again. So there was something about the way that the character, breaks with the past and begins anew that I thought it was very close to the way that Berlin is reinventing itself very much, and also the film begins in a neighborhood of Fortaleza, which is where I was born. It's called Praia do Futuro. It's called Futuro Beach, and it's the antipode of Futuro. It's a beach that was built. It's a neighborhood that was built in the 1970s, and it was never really occupied. So there's you feel like the future is arriving, but it's never really gotten there because of. It's a very interesting story because there's a lot of salt in the air and all the buildings are sort of crumbling and stuff. And for me, Berlin is kind of the antipode of that in the sense that, it's really like growing from the ashes at every moment, So there was also the wish to have this conversation of two landscapes and landscapes that have an outlook to the future and to the past that are quite opposite. So, yeah, it could have been here, it could have been in China, it could have been a bunch of places, the place that he went. But I think it was very interesting to have a character that goes to a place which is somehow a mirror of himself,
If we look at his previous film, Madame Satã, which I would argue is a very powerful portrait of a very marginalized gay society with a cross-dresser, the eponymous Madame Satã, you will see, I would argue it's an activist film. And then you moved on. That was back in 2002?
Yeah, 2002, yeah.
And then 12 years later, we see Praia do Futuro, where homosexuality is less of an issue. So I think that's in line with Brazilian society moving on. But now we're seeing the reverse movement. How would you say, we've seen a lot of sudden changes in Brazil. Yeah. We saw Dilma's impeachment, a very sudden and violent shift to the right. How would you argue that this could affect, and in the short and in the long term, the film industry from both a creative and economic and aesthetic perspective?
I don't think it could affect. I think it's technically affecting. I think that we're talking about the present, and I think it's what's very scary, and I think it has to do with what's happening politically. But I think there's such a wave of intolerance happening in Brazil, and I think it's a wave of intolerance that's coming perhaps from religious uprisings and religious fundamentalism with the evangelical. Not every evangelical is intolerant, but I think there is a whole wave of intolerance happening in Brazil towards everything, towards diversity. And I think that there will be. It's very interesting. It took me 8 years to do Madame Satã, and I remember when I started to develop Madame Satã. It's funny, I started to write, I was living in London at the time, it was 1994, and I started to write the project. And I am stubborn. So it took me 8 years to get that film done because nobody wanted to touch it, And at the time, the financing sort of mechanism we have today, they were not in place at the time. It was 1994, and I think we financed the film in 2000. So at the time, it was the beginning again of, the Ministry of Culture, and Embrafilme had been discontinued. It was a very complicated time. And funny enough, with Praia do Futuro, I think we financed it in 2 years, So it says something about diversity and, and sort of how cultural institutions were able to dialogue with diversity and to relate to diversity. And I think what we're facing now, it's very interesting. I'm at the moment writing a project about an evangelical priest, I'm really think we need to talk about that, and I'm writing a project actually for Wagner in the main role, and pretty much on the lines of Godfather, like the fall and the rise of an evangelical priest. And it's very interesting because the project is taking a bit longer to develop, and we're still struggling with the script. It's a story that's kind of delicate to write. It's just not on a political level, but on a technical level. I don't know if it will ever be done. I don't know if it will ever be financed, So it's a kind of a moment that I feel very But let's be optimistic. At the same time, I think that we're mobilizing, there's a sense of political mobilization in Brazil that maybe we will continue a certain path that we were. But I think that we actually are facing a moment in our country, which is very much, the tone is intolerance. And I think it's very sad. I think it's very sad and it's very complicated. And I think there will be repercussions in the way that we speak. What I mean is there will be repercussions in the way of the films we make, the songs we write, the way we live, And I think again, I'm not a pessimist person. I'm very optimist. So I prefer to think that it's a very provisory phase that we live in. But
do you think that this reactionary moment is exclusive to Brazil, or do you think we look at Trump, we look at Brexit? Okay, do you think it's a global movement?
Yeah, I think it's totally it's a late capitalist problem. We're facing disaster capitalism. Capitalism can only exist if we destroy the planet. Otherwise it will not go on. So I think it's very fascinating and horrifying about the times we live. And I think going back to Praia do Futuro, I think really the reason I wanted to make that film is I wanted to talk about fear and to talk about courage. There's a braveness in the character of Donato. I was very much interested in how fear is actually something that's been constructed in the last 10 years for capitalism to be able to exist. It's all about creating an enemy it's forging an enemy more than anything else. So I think it's not something that it's not a privilege of the moment that we live in Brazil. I think it's happening everywhere because, Brexit is creating a fake enemy, but that enemy needs to be created for you to be able to enforce certain economic and political decisions. And I think it's happening everywhere. You look at Germany, where I'm living now. One day I wake up, I remember this if it were today, it was about 2 months ago, and there's the results of the local elections, and Alternative for Germany has 35% of the votes, and it's super interesting when you look at it, though it's constructed, it's immediately after New Year's Eve with all the things that, they said. Well, and there's everything that was talked about in Cologne, supposedly attacks in Cologne. So we're not living, it's not happening by accident, it's being constructed. There was a fantastic interview I saw 3 days ago in British radio. I don't know if you saw that. It's a very well-known British radio person that was talking about the killing of Joe Cox.
Yes.
It was just fantastic. He was just saying how it's hard to understand, but yet when you wake up every day and all the media is
telling you that they're coming to take your house, to attack you,
shit will happen. Sorry to use the word, but so I think it's something that's happening all around the world, and it's almost like the last breath, of an economic model that cannot hold anymore. And then what I think is also very interesting is the question of fear is very played out, and I think the question of natural resources. You can do anything to defend your natural resources. So the question is how can democracy live together, in a situation like this, because it's very serious. And I think what's very, very serious, and it's funny, I was reading an interview what we talked about before I came in with Naomi Klein, and it's the only way that these new laws and these new kind of neoliberal, economic positions can be forced upon us is through crisis. In this crisis, they're
electroshocking them, as
and then you go and do that. So I think what I think is very sad about Brazil, is that, it's been 500 years since the Portuguese arrived there, and it's been only 5 presidents that had finished their mandate. So, I come from a generation, I was born in 1966, I remember as if it were today, and going to the supermarket, and then you just hear this clack, 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 it was the price. Every day the price, there was an inflation, there was a sense of that the sense that we had to pay the national debt. There was a sense of being close to a cliff. And then there was a moment that we could breathe. And then we're back again to a situation where we're close to a cliff, and that I think is
cyclical, perhaps.
But it's very recent. One thing is to have a country that has endured a longer history and that has somehow, this democracy is something which is a bit more solid. And that's why I find it's really sad.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's just really sad. But let's not get sad. Let's get angry.
Yeah, let's move on. Well, the reason why we're here, the reason why Dirty Movie exists is because we strongly believe that film is a transformational tool, that film can help people to think. Films like the one Karim made film can bring about change in the society, in the community, personal change. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Karim.
Thank you
for the opportunity. Thank you very much, the Brazilian Embassy, for having us, and thank you for being with us. Goodbye.
Thank you.